And we talked about how heart rate is just an intrinsic function. In the absence of any kind of neural regulation of the heart, it's going to continue to beat at the rate that is set by the SA node, which is usually about 90 to 100 beats per minute. So this is without any neural regulation coming from the brain. Next week or the week after, we're going to take a look at what is that regulation from the brain that's coming in that helps to slow it down so that our heart isn't actually beating every time between a 90 and 100. But the way that it is set to is to do it at 90 to 100. And so it's coming through our autonomic innervation that is what we will be influenced as far as what ends up happening within the heart. But intrinsically, it wants to fire at that 90 to 100. So when we take our heart rate and we multiply it by our stroke volume, we get what's called our cardiac output. So when we look at it, we look at heart rate is the number of beats per minute, and we're multiplying that by how much is leaving the heart with each beat. So the volume of blood that's leaving the heart with each beat. When we multiply those two together, we're basically taking how much blood is, or volume of blood is leaving the heart over the course of that minute. And that is how we define what the cardiac output is. So it's the amount of blood pumped out of each ventricle in 1 minute's time. It's determined by that stroke volume and that heart rate, as we just said. So that's literally the equation to be able to do that, is stroke volume times heart rate. When we look at it, cardiac output is usually measured in milliliters per minute. Stroke volume is how many milliliters per beat, right? So we take a look at how many milliliters per beat is leaving the heart. And then our heart rate is how many beats per minute. And that's why it equals out to milliliters per minute. Now, if we took an average person and say like the average person has a stroke volume of around 70 milliliters per beat and maybe around 75 beats per minute, right? Somewhere falling in between that 60 to 100 beats per minute. And we were to multiply that out, it ends up being about 5,250 milliliters per minute. When we convert that down and just put it into liters, it's about 5.25 liters per minute. And that's just on average during a resting time period. What's interesting is that's approximately the amount of blood that we contain within our body, depending on what our body size is. So cardiac output is also demonstrated sometimes by using a Q with a sub C underneath it. So Q often stands for flow when we're looking at it as far as the body goes. When we move into physics, that's what that definition is. Q often means flow, and then the C is standing for the cardiac portion of it. So our total blood volume is equal to about 5 to 6 liters, sometimes only 4 to 5 in younger or smaller populations, smaller people. So the heart is pumping out the equivalent of the total blood volume that we have each minute under just normal resting conditions. So somebody had asked previous in the term, like, how long does it take for that one red blood cell to pump all the way around its body until it's back again? And it takes about 1 minute under resting conditions. However, we need to be able to draw on and capitalize on the system a little bit more, right? So as soon as we start taxing the system, we require more oxygen. The only way to beat more oxygen around in our body is to actually increase our heart rate, right? Breathe more to get more oxygen in, and then increase our heart rate to be able to deliver it faster. So we have to have some kind of a cardiac reserve, the ability for our heart to increase the cardiac output above what these normal limits are. Right? So one of the major benefits of exercise is increasing our parasympathetic stimulation, right? And we talked about this at the very beginning of the term and took a look at parasympathetic stimulation is what lowers our resting heart rate, right? That's one of the effects that it has. And so it's going to play into that if we can even lower that, as like the healthier we become, we can actually lower that more and more and more, so that when we start exercising, we have more room to be able to expand our cardiac output to deliver the oxygen everywhere that it needs to go. So maximum cardiac output ranges Typically around 14 to 16 liters per minute in the untrained individual, so somebody who's kind of just recreationally active, about 20 to 25 liters per minute in the trained individual. Right. So when we look at it and we look at a person and say like they're exercising currently and their heart rate is around 150 beats per minute and their stroke volume can actually increase quite considerably up to about 140 liters per minute, milliliters per minute, which can equal about 21 liters per minute. That is a whole lot of blood pumping around in the body because we need to be bringing all of that oxygen to support the activities that we're doing. In really, really highly conditioned endurance athletes, sometimes it's been seen up to about 40 liters per minute, which is just a massive amount of cardiac output. The last thing that we have to talk about is just ejection fraction, which is looking at a proportion or can be defined as a percentage of the blood pumped out of the left ventricle with each beat. So we're basically going to take our stroke volume, divide it by our end diastolic volume, right? So it's just looking at how much is remain, like where it's taking the percentage, right, of how much did we pump out versus how much started in there to begin with. And then to turn it into a percentage, we multiply it by 100, and that gives us our ejection fraction. What's the importance of the ejection fraction? It is a marker of health, right? As we have worse cardiovascular system, more cardiovascular risk symptoms, we can start to lower that ejection fraction because we're not capitalizing on how much we can actually beat, right? Ejection fraction can increase with more contractility we have and the more exercise that we have. But let's say we've got somebody who's deconditioned, and instead of like beating the heart so that it's got a good motion like, you know, like this, instead it's like barely moving at all and not pumping very much out. And it's one of the markers that we have that we can measure to find out what somebody's cardiovascular system is like.